Okay, itu adalah hemoglobin that is present in red blood cells ataupun erythrocytes. But we have another pigment yang boleh bind dengan oksigen yang kita panggil myoglobin. Okay, dan as the name suggests, myo means muscle, means its presence in skeletal muscle. Dalam awak punya bicep, dalam awak punya six pack, dalam awak punya triceps, punggung, which is gluteus maximus, your hamstrings, your everything, itu adalah skeletal muscles. Okay, yang Attack on Titan tu, Colossal Titan tu, basically itu semua adalah yang ditunjuk tu, itu adalah skeletal muscle. Dalam tu banyak banyak myoglobin. Okay, dan kalau awak tengok the more myoglobin, the darker the meat. Okay, kalau contohnya daging lembu tu macam sangat merah, yang merah kebiruan, merah kehitaman tu, means that sangat banyak myoglobin. Sebab lembu tu dia perlu berjalan dan dia kena simpan oksigen. Okay, that's why dia memang darker the meat lah, you know, the more myoglobin. Apa itu myoglobin molecule? Okay, kalau awak tengok myoglobin molecule, it is widely distributed in animals that is present commonly in skeletal muscles. Dan compare kepada hemoglobin, okay, myoglobin ni memang ada myoglobin ni memang ada high affinity towards oxygen. Okay, memang dia sangat-sangat high affinity, memang dia sangat bind dengan oksigen, dia sangat prefer oksigen lah basically. That's why disebabkan ada high affinity towards oxygen, that's why the main function of myoglobin memang untuk store oksigen instead of to transport oksigen. Tidak, memang function dia memang untuk store oksigen because it has this high affinity, very strong affinity kepada oksigen. Okay, sama juga in term of structure, diorang ni lebih kurang sama je dengan hemoglobin. In term of dimensional structure, it has very similar structure to the hemoglobin, cuma dia tidak ada 4 subunit, hanya melibatkan satu subunit daripada satu chain. Only one chain that is present means that hanya satu heme group saja yang present. Only one heme group yang present dalam satu myoglobin. Sebab dia hanya ada satu subunit, okay, daripada satu chain of polypeptide. That's why dia ada hanya satu heme group. Right? The pigment may also bind pada oxygen, but since there is one heme group, means that there is no cooperative binding. Cooperative binding, okay, yang bind 1, 2, 3, 4 hanya akan boleh sekiranya ada lebih daripada satu subunit. Tetapi disebabkan hanya ada satu subunit that is present in myoglobin, that's why there is no myoglobin. And only release oxygen in extreme condition. Bila badan memerlukan oksigen yang teramat, barulah oksigen tadi dirilis daripada myoglobin. That's why the function of myoglobin memang untuk as oxygen storing molecules, ataupun dia memang function dia memang to store oxygen rather than for oxygen transport. Okay, and it wouldn't be as efficient as transfer oxygen, dan only bila, as I said, bila betul-betul oksigen diperlukan, barulah oksigen tadi dah akan release daripada myoglobin. Means that only when the partial pressure of oxygen is very low, that oxygen will be released from myoglobin ke dalam cells, which is ke dalam skeletal muscles lah. Otherwise dia memang tidak akan di-release, sebab memang function myoglobin sebagai oxygen storing, untuk simpan oksigen ketika when the partial pressure of oxygen is very low. Alright, dan disebabkan itulah kerana myoglobin ada high affinity kepada oksigen lah, dia akan shift to the right. Okay, this graph of myoglobin dia akan shift to the right, dan disebabkan dia hanya ada satu subunit, means that dia tidak ada cooperative binding, means that dia tidak ada sigmoid shape of graph. Okay, hemoglobin ni kenapa bentuk dia S? Kerana ada cooperative binding. Tetapi disebabkan myoglobin tu hanya ada satu subunit, that's why bentuk dia macam ni lah, exponential. Okay, so exponential. Bentuk dia like this, you know, is not sigmoid shape. Dan as I said, only when the partial pressure of oxygen is very low that myoglobin akan release oxygen. Bila partial pressure of oxygen is low, that barulah oxygen is released daripada myoglobin. Kalau Kalau partial pressure of oxygen tidak low, dia memang tidak akan release. Masa ni dia memang tak akan release, dia tak akan release langsung oksigen daripada diri dia walaupun dekat 30. You tengok hanya below 20. When the partial pressure of oxygen is very low, that dia barulah release the oxygen daripada diri dia. Okay? Dan dia tidak ada S shape kerana dia bukan, it has only one subunit. It has no cooperative binding. Okay? It only begins to release oxygen when the partial pressure of oxygen is below 20 mmHg saja. Is very low lah. Okay, maksudnya. Dan kalau awak boleh nampak dia memang ada high affinity towards oxygen. Kalau kita baca secara, if we read like this means, kalau kita baca ke kiri, kita baca macam mana oxygen to release. Okay. But kalau kita baca ke atas ataupun ke kanan, oxygen bind. Okay. Sama juga macam hemoglobin. Kalau kita baca ke kiri means ke bawah, kita boleh nampak oksigen, how do oxygen is released. But kalau kita baca ke atas, sama, dia adalah how oxygen is bind. Okay. Sama juga macam myoglobin. Kalau awak tengok, semakin kurang partial pressure of oxygen, only bila below 20 mmHg saja barulah oxygen is released. Tetapi kalau awak tengok, sekiranya ada peningkatan of partial pressure of oxygen, even let's say at 5, you boleh nampak bahawa memang myoglobin ni dia terus bind dengan oxygen and dia akan reach dia punya saturation point at 20 mg of 20 mmHg. Maksudnya sekarang even at very low partial pressure of oxygen, dia memang akan baru dia release dan dia memang akan bind dengan oxygen. Maksudnya dia ada strong affinity kepada oxygen. Okay? Even at very low partial pressure of oxygen, dia still bind dengan, dia still terima oxygen, it will still bind dengan oxygen. Maksudnya dia memang ada strong affinity kepada oxygen lah. Okay, sebab even at very low partial pressure of oxygen, dia bind dengan oxygen. Okay. So again, as I said, kalau kita baca ke kiri, kita baca oxygen release. Kalau kita baca ke kanan, is macam mana oxygen is bind. Sama juga macam hemoglobin, alright? So, in this way that awak boleh nampak only when the partial pressure of oxygen is too low that it releases oxygen. Apakah kepentingannya? Only in this way that dia akan act as a store of oxygen in resting muscle. Okay? Kalau kita tahu bahawa in resting tissue 40 mg and 40 mmHg, masa ni kita adalah resting tissue. Dekat resting tissue, kita tahu, we know that pada ketika ini muscle akan relax. And you still boleh nampak even at resting muscle tissue, myoglobin is saturated with oxygen sebab dia ada very high saturation with oxygen. Ni kan oxygen saturation kan. Okay. Even at 40 mmHg, you boleh nampak 40 pula, 100 pula. Even at 40 mmHg, okay, at resting tissue, kita boleh nampak myoglobin memang fully is saturated with oxygen. That's why function myoglobin memang akan store oxygen in resting muscle. Dia akan release oxygen bila hemoglobin memang dah haus, memang it's too, memang terlampau tak cukup oksigen, barulah okay, myoglobin tadi dia akan release oksigen, okay, untuk support the oksigen yang dirilis oleh hemoglobin. And the myo-oxygen dissociation curve menunjukkan hyperbolic curve. Okay, this myoglobin menunjukkan bentuk hyperbolic rather than sigmoid. Kenapa? Because it has no cooperative binding. Okay, itulah jawapan dia. Alright. Dan kalau kita compare oxygen dissociation curve dengan hemoglobin and myoglobin, untuk myoglobin dia hanya ada satu heme, untuk hemoglobin dia ada 4 heme. Untuk myoglobin is found in skeletal muscle, hemoglobin pula found in erythrocyte ataupun red blood cells. Untuk myoglobin function dia for oxygen storage, hemoglobin pula oxygen and carbon dioxide transport, and myoglobin dia bagi shape hyperbolic dissociation curve, manakala hemoglobin dia bagi sigmoid dissociation curve. Kenapa dia hyperbolic? Because there is no cooperative binding. Kenapa? Because hemoglobin hanya satu subunit. Bila satu subunit, dia tak ada cooperative binding. That's why dia terus hyperbolic curve lah rather than sigmoid. Sebab sigmoid dia akan, satu subunit akan bind, then second subunit akan change conformation menyebabkan dia akan increase affinity pada oxygen, so dia akan bind oxygen. Third subunit pula akan change conformation, dia akan bind lagi. The rest eventually the fourth subunit akan bind oxygen so that dia akan saturated lah. That's why dia pump. Okay, itu adalah hemoglobin punya dissociation curve. Dan if you compare the dissociation curve between hemoglobin and myoglobin, myoglobin and hemoglobin bind oxygen very well when the concentration of oxygen is really high, for example in lung. Okay, kalau kita compare, ini adalah similarities dia. In similarities, myoglobin and hemoglobin dia akan bind dengan oxygen very well bila concentration of oxygen is really high, contohnya dalam lung. Tetapi hemoglobin is more likely to release oxygen in the area of low concentration in tissues, even at 40 mmHg. Kalau kita tengok in resting muscle tissue, dekat 40 mmHg of partial pressure or oxygen, masa ni 30% of hemoglobin memang dah release oxygen, okay, untuk hemoglobin. Tetapi dekat at 40 dekat 40 mmHg, 98% of myoglobin masih ada, still ada oksigen. Ini adalah myoglobin. Itu yang dikatakan, okay, bila in low concentration ataupun in low partial pressure of oxygen, the one yang akan the more likely to release oxygen adalah hemoglobin. Contohnya kita tengoklah partial pressure at 40 mmHg, 30% of hemoglobin memang dah release oxygen. Hanya 70% saja yang saturated dengan oxygen. Tetapi dekat at 40 mmHg of partial pressure of oxygen, 98% of myoglobin saturated dengan oxygen. Maksudnya myoglobin ni dia memang susah nak release oxygen. Okay, that's why function dia sebagai store oxygen rather than transport of oxygen. Dan since hemoglobin bind oxygen less tightly than myoglobin in muscle tissue, that's why lah hemoglobin can effectively transport oxygen through the body and deliver to the cell. Kalau soalan tanya, what is the characteristic that allows the hemoglobin to memang akan transport the oxygen effectively, jawapannya sebab it binds to oxygen less tightly compared to myoglobin. Myoglobin ni dia bind oxygen very tightly. Dia kedekut, dia susah nak lepaskan. Bila dia susah nak lepaskan, that's why dia akan simpan macam awak lah. Awak susah nak move on, awak susah nak tinggalkan boyfriend awak. Awak pegang dia betul-betul, awak jaga dia elok-elok. Means that awak susah nak lepaskan. Awak simpan awak punya boyfriend. So you store the oxygen dalam myoglobin, okay? Tetapi fetal hemoglobin pula different. Kalau you tengok the baby Aaron ni, fetal dia ni agak different. Kenapa? Kalau you tengok fetal hemoglobin, okay, dia ada higher affinity kepada oksigen, okay. Yang ni cerita hemoglobin pula. Tadi dah habis myoglobin, okay. In term of oxygen dissociation curve, fetal hemoglobin dia ada higher affinity for oxygen than the mother hemoglobin. Kenapa? Kenapa? Disebabkan because dia perlu menerima oksigen daripada mother. Kalau dia tidak terima, kalau dia ada low affinity kepada oksigen, means that dia susah nak dapat oksigen, bayi akan mati. That's why bayi dia punya fetal hemoglobin, graph dia akan shift to the left sebab dia akan increase affinity towards the oxygen even at low partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. This is because the fetus gets oxygen from the mother across the placenta and is not very efficient. Disebabkan bayi tidak bernafas dalam kandungan, dia dapat oksigen daripada mother dia. So maksudnya dia akan ada pas-pas. So tak very efficient. That's why to ensure the efficiency of oxygen to be transported kepada fetus, memang fetal hemoglobin kena ada high affinity kepada oksigen. Kalau dia ada low affinity, bayi tu akan mati. Okay, that's why oksigen tadi, fetal punya hemoglobin memang kena ada high affinity kepada oksigen supaya dia akan increase the efficiency of oxygen binding kepada hemoglobin of the fetus lah, to ensure that the fetus akan properly obtain oxygen from the mother. Otherwise, bayi akan mati. That's why dia akan shift to the left. Kalau tengok even at the partial pressure of 20 mg, kita boleh nampak at 20 mmHg, bayi punya saturation with oxygen is very high compare kepada mother, iaitu pada 25, tetapi fetal dah 60. Means that dia ada high affinity kepada oxygen. Okay. Make sure awak pandai baca graph. Alright.